It's easy to look back and marvel at how far we have come. Yet sometimes retrospectives can reveal not everything was as it seemed. 150 years ago, the SS Atlantic wrecked in Nova Scotian waters. Its story has been distorted through time, leaving unanswered questions and wrong information to be presented as facts.
By the standards of her time, the SS Atlantic was a truly revolutionary ship. Throughout her years at sea, she transported thousands of immigrants from the old world to the new. However, on her 19th journey from Liverpool to New York, the SS Atlantic met her end. Following days of severe weather at sea, reports came from the chief engineer that she was running low on coal. This led the captain to redirect for Halifax in hopes of restocking. En route to Halifax Harbor, however, she ran ashore. As news and the story began to spread, it was twisted into something unrecognizable from the true events of what happened that day.
We're here to talk to Bob Chaulk, author of Atlantic's Last Stop, as well as a number of other books. He is a historian for the SS Atlantic Heritage Park and the recognized authority on the SS Atlantic disaster. Well, Bob, I'd like to thank you for coming in to have this conversation with us today. And it's, of course, a particularly poignant time to be talking about the SS Atlantic as we're coming up on this 150th anniversary of her sinking.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here. And you're right, it is a very, very important anniversary.
Absolutely. And so,
the Atlantic was a coal-burning steamship. She was going from Liverpool to New York. When they got not far from Halifax, the chief engineer, John Foxley, came to the captain, James Williams, came to him and said, we're down to 127 tons of coal. So really, the captain ended up with something that a captain of a steamship on the North Atlantic should never have, and that is a surprise. Fortunately, they were off Nova Scotia and they could go into Halifax, and that's what they did. So he was giving them their final orders. You should see Sambro Light at any moment. It should be off your port bow. As soon as you see it, I want you to call me. I'm going to lay down here and get some sleep. If you don't see the light by 3 o'clock, call me anyway. Guess what they didn't do? They didn't see the light. Guess what else they didn't do? They didn't call them. Why? Nobody knows. They ran at full speed into the province of Nova Scotia, literally. Well, how did that happen? Well, they were off course. You know, we've got a thing around the corner from Nova Scotia called the Bay of Fundy. That current was slowly and patiently moving the ship to the left. They were about 12 to 15 kilometers off course. So when she finally struck, she struck about halfway between Halifax and Peggy's Cove. And that's where the wreck is today. It's the biggest shipwreck in Nova Scotia history, second biggest in Canadian history, by the way. All the women died in the wreck, all the children except one. About 950 were aboard the ship, about 550 died. There were approximately 420 people survived. Now you say, well, why don't you give us the exact number? Impossible. The Titanic, they don't know how many people died in the Titanic. They're making good estimates and so on, but the information on any disaster, really any disaster, even today, you know, you got to bring it up to round numbers. So people ask me all the time, you know, where can I see a passenger list for the Atlantic, right? All the time, that's what people want. And they think that they're going to get the goods. I really put a lot of time in trying to figure out. I thought once and for all, I'm going to come to terms with who was on that ship. And I have 1,400 names. Well, there wasn't 1,400 people on the ship, but I have found 1,400 names.
Really?
Yeah. You know, so it's just hopeless. Absolutely out of the question. And people don't believe you.
So there is one image that has sort of become synonymous with the wreck of the Atlantic, but from what I'm led to believe, it's not very accurate in its depiction of the events that occurred that day.
Not very accurate is pretty accurate. This was put out just after the wreck by Courier and Ives, a company in the United States, large company that did prints. And it was done before anybody really knew anything about the wreck, because the thing was in those days, get it out, right? First of all, because it was a huge story. Because all the women died, all the children died except one, captain was asleep, and on and on and on, right? So the newspapers are going out of their minds. So anybody who's doing anything that has to do with the Atlantic, they trot this thing out because they don't really know. Yeah, you can't blame them. They don't know.
Right.
You know, it looks like, okay, it looks like a pretty dramatic story, but it's incorrect on a number of fronts. The main one really is that the ship is lying the wrong way. You may say, oh, you're being kind of anal about this, aren't you? No, they have it leaning towards the land. And if you actually take a close look at it, you can see very dramatically all the water in the air where the waves are supposedly hitting the outside of the ship. But the ship was actually leaning the other way. Now, you think of those waves, what are they going to do? They're going to wash right up on the deck and wash everybody overboard. But instead, they've got zillions of people on the deck, protected because of the way the ship's lying. So that's one thing. Another thing is that they have this rope, and it's true, the rope did go across and people came across on the rope. But for starters, the rope is up in the air. If you had those people on that rope, it would be down in the water. There were men who pulled themselves along, but they were right in the water, and some drowned while on the rope. And they're going in the wrong direction. And then on top of that, the water is full of women. One woman there in the lower right, she's just being helped out of the water. Some of the women have babies in their arms. I've never seen a woman swimming around with a baby in her arms before, especially in 1 or 2 degree
Right.
water. So it's just a bad thing. I wish they all disappeared.
Bob, could you speak a little bit to the people that lived nearby that came to the rescue of these people as they were going into the water?
They were fisher folk hanging off the rocks, literally. And the rescue was really led by just 5 families. So the Clancys, the Ryans, James Coolin, O'Briens, and Blackburns. So there's your 5 families. Michael Clancy was the first Canadian to see the wreck of the Atlantic. They went down to find out what the heck was going on. Out of nowhere comes this sopping, staggering, half-dead man, Robert Thomas, one of the quartermasters. He basically told them what was going on. He was near death. So they sent him back to the house to get some dry clothes and warmed up. And it was there that the real heroine of the whole rescue lived. That was Michael Clancy's 28-year-old daughter, Sarah Jane. She had 2 children of her own, 5 and 2. So she had her hands full, but she ended up with about 375 people going through the hut that night. Very, very, very busy time for her. And there were 4 Ryans involved. I know some of their direct descendants, met them, had the pleasure of telling them that their great-great-grandfather was involved with the rescue. They were over the moon.
They were unaware of that.
They were unaware of it.
Really?
150 years, right? So a long time. So down they go, and they see this ship lying on her side, sunken in the stern, and they look, and there's this flat rock out there that the ship had struck. By now the ship was off of the rock and was on her side on a ledge just out from the rock. And there was a rope across. They had swum a rope across to the rock and were trying to pull their way across on the rope. A lot of men were dying, just doing that. By then, virtually all of the women were dead. So they got a dory, they put the dory out, 2 guys go out in the dory, they almost flip it over, waves are hitting them, that's no sense. So they bring the dory back. Well, there's only one thing to do, we need to get a seine boat. And off they went and started taking men off the rock. Why didn't they go out to the wreck? Because the tide was coming in. And at high tide, the rock's buried. They knew that, but nobody else did. So that's why they were doing it. Meantime, the captain's over there on the ship saying, what about us, right? Because the ship was really rickety, it could go over at any time. So basically, over a period from about 6 o'clock, 6 a.m., until about 9:30, 10 a.m., they rescued, my guess is between 375 and 400 people, with the exception of 3 people.
So Bob, there's another story, and a story that was perhaps at the time even more popular, or was at the time far more popular in the press and so on. And could you speak a little bit about that story?
Yeah, that's William Ancient, the Reverend William Ancient. A very interesting man, actually, and an important character in the story. He was a missionary. Terrence Bay was where he was located. He got out to the wreck site around noon. So he looks and he says, there's 3 people up there, what's going on? And they said, well, we can't get at them. We're waiting until until the tide goes out. Okay, makes sense, So being an energetic guy, off he goes, helping the survivors and whatnot, getting them, finding places for them to live, like a good pastor. He comes back, when he figures the tide is low. Walks out, they're still up there. James Coolan's boat's there. James Coolan just went home to get dry clothes on, to come back and get them. He jumps in the boat, gets 4 guys to go with him, out they go. The hero, according to the newspapers were concerned.
Right.
And it was a dramatic rescue. And he himself said that the fishermen who were doing the rescue could have done it, but he had much more experience on big ships and therefore was better suited, so he went for it.
Right.
That would be ancient, right? Pragmatic. He never said that they, and nobody did. Nobody ever said they didn't do a great job and they weren't heroic. But ancient was a poster child. Good-looking man of the cloth, Protestant in those days, right? All these people were Catholic. Ooh, right, Irish. Ooh. Therefore, the newspapers, without ever really saying anything, he became their darling. Right. And after a while it was, there should be rewards for Mr. Ancient and the other parties who helped with the rescue, right? And that's what it was. Other parties who helped with the rescue.
Helped with the rescue.
Helped with the rescue, right?
So Bob, a lot of the focus of our conversation has been about the sort of distortion of the story surrounding the Atlantic. Could you go a little more into that?
I think it's because so much was written about it. And of course, it's the biggest shipwreck in Nova Scotia history. To be fair to the newspaper folks, if you look at Halifax papers, Nova Scotia papers, about every 10 years or so, you open it up and it always starts off, guess what? There was a huge dramatic shipwreck that took place in Nova Scotia in 1873, as though nobody's ever heard of this, and I'm telling you about it.
Right.
So that person had just learned about it. So what do? They go rooting around to find what they can, right? And they've got a deadline. So they write it up. A little bit's going to drift in there for sure. Now the next generation's going to take those same ones, and on we go. Thing is, and here's my quote that I give to people all the time, we are awash in a sea of untruth in our lives. So not only having to do with the Atlantic, but having to do with history in general. You read a book and you learn about something and you close the book and off you go. And then 5 years later, you see a book about the same subject. You pick it up, you start reading it, it says something different. This guy's an idiot. It was this. You believe what you read first.
Bob, thank you for coming and having this conversation with us today. It's been a wonderful opportunity trying to get a more accurate version of events out there for the history of the wreck of the SS Atlantic. And I understand that there's a means by which some people can learn some more about this.
Absolutely. I love talking about the Atlantic, as you know, so much, and I like writing about it as well. So this is my second book, actually, about the Atlantic, called Atlantic's Last Stop. When we finished the first one, it was a co-authorship with my good friend. I thought, there's another book that has to be written. There's more that we missed. So it's all in here.
Our history is an ever-evolving process, a self-correcting one. The hard truth is that history can be distorted. There's so much more to be said about the SS Atlantic. Leading up to this anniversary, we wanted to highlight resources dedicated to telling this story. If you want to know more, please visit the Heritage Park and Museum or read Bob's book, Atlantic's Last Stop. We are our stories. It's important to preserve them to the best of our abilities.